Humans are not inherently selfish and cruel any more than flamingos are born pink. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we have allowed certain narratives to infect the cultural zeitgeist of what we consider to be the human condition. It's easy to look around us and see very pervasive attitudes in human beings that seem very self-absorbed, very individualistic, selfish. But I'm also quite positive that this idea that humans are inherently predatory and opportunistic in a way that is bad, is intentionally kind of created propaganda that serves capitalists and, the billionaire class, because it's like a cope for them too, right? They have to resolve within themselves that it's like natural. And we're going to go over this in another video, but that's actually the original reason when Darwin first came up with his theories that people didn't like it. It actually had nothing to do with the idea that, humans are being called animals. It was more that they were worried, and they were right because they did use it in this way, that oppressive people groups would then use that to justify their oppression and things like manifest destiny on the fact that it was just human nature, which, to be fair also, is also a misunderstanding of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest doesn't mean the strongest. It just means whatever is most adaptive to sudden changes and the most malleable, so to the circumstances that are presented. And I do find this funny about human beings. We're so angry at the concept of needing to change, and yet that's like our greatest strength, and it was the edge that allowed us to survive multiple times where we almost went extinct. And we know this because our genetics are very thin, so we know that because of this lack of genetic variance, that we descended from like a small group of people several times. Several times, so a lot of us didn't make it at these bottlenecks. Anyway, let's take this back to flamingos. So when you see that pictures of flamingos, or even just out in the wild, and you observe they're all pink, it's natural to assume that, yeah, that means flamingos are pink. That is a fact. Flamingos are just pink. That seems to be the natural order of things. But when you really look into it, you learn that they're not born pink. It's actually not their feathers' natural color. In fact, sometimes when you go to zoos, you see them, they tend to be more pale than pink and closer to white. And it's because of their diet, specifically that involves a kind of algae that the krill they also eat. And you have to understand that the water that they inhabit is literally so septic and full of bacteria. Like, there's no other animals that can get into it safely usually. And that's kind of the advantage to these ponds that are, I can't remember if they're highly acidic or highly alkaline. It's one of those two extremes, but you can kind of observe how foul this water is when they are unlucky enough to get like a wound on their leg. It like quickly swells up and gets infected, and it's not a good time. So, but they've adapted in a way to learn to get sustenance from this highly like toxic environment that's like, foul and filthy. So after you recognize that, you understand that the conditions are what create that. The condition is what creates that color, the color pink. So, and then you have to realize and ask yourselves, so is this really the human condition, to observe how pervasive it seems to be that people tend to act selfishly and cruelly and in mostly self-interest, which I think is kind of untrue as well anyway, but it's hard not to, because it is enough of a problem that it seems like it's a disproportionate amount of the human race, and maybe that is still the case. You also recognize that we did build an ecosystem of suffering that monetizes that suffering, that rewards that predatory exploitative behavior, and seems to sometimes punish behavior that isn't like that. Is it reasonable that humans would tend to go that direction? It makes sense. I mean, so if I were to shove a bunch of crabs in a boiling pot of water and they start killing each other to try to get out, does that really indicate that the crabs are inherently awful and predisposed to killing each other, that it's just in their nature to be violent and horrible? We need to take a step back. I think we need to be brave enough to ask ourselves what happens when we venture outside of the pond. No matter how painful the conditions we live in are, it is familiar, okay? It is familiar, and going outside the pond is not. We don't know that we'll succeed or not, and that can be very daunting. It can be daunting to leave a system that we were born into, to try to challenge and make it. And I think if we were to do it on our own, it would be very challenging. And that's kind of why they try to discourage people from thinking they can live in other ways. But you can live in other ways. And in fact, if we go back to how we used to be, not to, romanticize the past, but at the very least, at its core of, human inclination, we are a cooperative species. We didn't survive because we killed everybody else. In fact, that's a theory, and I'm quite sure the planet was undergoing severe cataclysmic changes that just most couldn't survive, including Homo sapiens sapiens. So we got through it by pooling our skills and resources together and supplanting for each other's weaknesses and deficiencies, and that's really the only way through. And I think once we are able to successfully build these supportive interdependent systems, we'll find that it's actually more sustainable and supportive than what we've been given. And consider also the fact that the powers that should not be want you to feel like you can't do this, that you have no choice but to rely on this poison water. And that's just not true. And the sad fact is, whether you want to make it your choice or not, how we've been living is not sustainable in the long run. We're at a level of technology now and influence on the wider world that will literally end us if we keep behaving in these ways. There's not an advantage anymore to being so hostile to other members of our species. It is a problem. It is not, it's not a survival strat, and it's going to make itself pretty well known too. Like the people that you consider billionaires and all these things, it's not working for them anymore either, and they're just too stubborn to change course. They're too stubborn to change course. You are kind of in an advantage in that you don't have as much to lose because the system's not giving you hardly anything anyway. So you should use that to empower yourself. Take what you perceive to be disadvantages to be advantages. If you have nothing to lose, then let's try something different. Consider making these systems or finding out if there's already people trying to do this in your area. We have been previously subsisting off of a system in which the interests of empire and capital have benefited from a very crab bucket kind of mindset. You can't have a world where everyone lives comfortably and is equal, and a world that values exclusivity, because that's what creates luxury. It's not quality and access to high quality goods, it's exclusivity that defines luxury. And under that standard, you're going to have a world that continues to need people who are less or above other people, and that cannot work anymore. So it's time to ask ourselves, what color would we be if we left the poison?